The greatest lie perpetuated by the Holy Inquisition is the concept of sudden, violent corruption. The ecclesiarchy teaches the terrified masses that a soul falls to the ruinous powers through grand blasphemous rituals, or the sudden, agonizing possession by a warp entity. They paint heresy as a loud theatrical tragedy. But true cosmic corruption is rarely a violent invasion. It is a quiet, excruciatingly slow process of psychological erosion. It is not the explosive shattering of a vault door, but the silent, deliberate unlocking of a latch from the inside. Today, we dissect the anatomy of damnation. We will analyze the microscopic, imperceptible shift in human cognition when the immense pressure of a grimdark galaxy finally breaks a mortal mind, and the abyss steps in to offer a comforting hand. The human consciousness in the 41st millennium is an organism bred entirely for endurance, heavily fortified by the brutal indoctrination of the imperial cult. From birth, the mind is taught to operate as a sealed fortress, constantly vigilant against the encroaching darkness. However, a fortress is only as strong as its foundation, and the Imperium demands that its citizens build their mental defenses upon a bedrock of absolute, unrelenting suffering. The daily reality of a scribe, a soldier, or a laborer is a crushing sequence of exhaustion, fear, and zero emotional reward. The mind is forced to process trauma at a rate that biologically outpaces its capacity to heal. Over decades, this relentless atmospheric pressure does not necessarily breed outward rebellion. Rather, it creates a microscopic, almost invisible cognitive fatigue. The faith that once burned like a torch is slowly reduced to a dying ember, suffocated not by sudden malice, but by the sheer, unyielding gravity of existing in a universe that actively hates them. The descent into heresy almost never begins with the worship of dark gods. It begins with a profoundly rational desire for an alternative solution. Consider an imperial commander who has watched his regiment bleed out in the mud for 6 agonizing months, perfectly executing strategic doctrines that only result in further pointless slaughter. The cognitive dissonance between the absolute infallibility of the God Emperor and the brutal, mechanical failure of his war machine begins to violently stretch the commander's sanity. The mind, desperate to protect itself from the reality of meaningless death, searches for a variable it can control. The fall does not start with a blood sacrifice. It starts with a slight deviation from the tactical codex. It starts with the justification that a necessary cruelty today will prevent a greater tragedy tomorrow. The commander compromises his morality just a fraction of an inch, entirely convinced he is doing so in the name of the Imperium. But in the Immaterium, that fraction of an inch is a gaping wound. The warp is not merely a parallel dimension of swirling energies and fanged leviathans. It is a hypersensitive, metaphysical mirror reflecting the absolute worst of human emotion. It does not actively hunt the strong and the faithful. It patiently waits for the exhausted to stop swimming. When a human mind is pushed into the dark corners of its own despair, it emits a specific, highly nutritious psychic resonance. The entity that answers this distress call never introduces itself as a demon. It introduces itself as a sudden moment of profound, crystalline clarity. To the overworked administratum clerk, driven to the brink of suicide by insurmountable quotas, it manifests as a sudden, brilliant shortcut in the mathematics. To the dying soldier abandoned in a trench, it manifests as the sudden cessation of pain and the warm, comforting sensation of being deeply understood. The ruinous powers do not breach the mind with battering rams. They slip in through the cracks created by imperial neglect, cleverly disguising their horrific sentience as the victim's own original thoughts. The exact moment the mind truly falls is terrifying in its absolute lack of ceremony. It is not accompanied by a flash of hellfire or the immediate violent mutation of flesh. It is a quiet, singular heartbeat where a fundamental boundary is permanently crossed. It is the exact second the mind looks at the cold, silent statues of the Emperor and then looks into the swirling, attentive darkness of the abyss and makes a conscious, biological choice to choose the latter. The horror lies in the fact that the victim feels absolutely no guilt in this moment. Instead, they experience a euphoric, terrifying wave of relief. The crushing, lifelong burden of imperial duty evaporates, replaced by the intoxicating, venomous illusion of true agency. The lock has been turned from the inside. The mind remains entirely convinced of its own righteousness, blissfully unaware that it has just willingly tethered its soul to a predator that will spend the rest of eternity digesting it. The true insidious genius of the Immaterium is that it does not utilize a universal, monolithic methodology for corruption. It acts as an immaculate, bespoke tailor of psychological ruin. The warp entity anchoring itself to the host's mind does not simply broadcast a generic, overwhelming frequency of evil that would be too easily recognized, too quickly purged by the rigid conditioning of the imperial cult. Instead, the entity meticulously maps the specific emotional deficits, the unspoken traumas, and the deeply repressed desires of the individual. It reads the mind like a biological ledger, calculating exactly where the psychic armor is wearing thin under the immense crushing weight of the 41st millennium. To the brutally oppressed underhive enforcer drowning in a sea of unpunished corruption, the abyss does not offer anarchy. It offers the intoxicating righteous geometry of absolute justice. To the brilliant but overlooked magos of the Mechanicus, suffocating under dogmatic restrictions, it does not offer heresy, it offers the irresistible, unchained mathematical equations that the priesthood actively forbids. The tragedy of the fall lies precisely in its initial purity. The hooks of chaos are almost entirely baited with arguably virtuous, fundamentally human desires. The need to protect the innocent, the drive to improve a failing system, or the desperate yearning to feel a single fleeting moment of genuine agency in a galaxy of ash. The predator approaches the starving prey not with a drawn blade, but with a lavish feast cleverly disguised as salvation. The initial cognitive dissonance is microscopic, manifesting as a subtle, entirely rationalized deviation from the imperial creed. The host does not wake up and decide to burn an orphanage. They wake up and decide that executing one innocent informant is a mathematically acceptable cost to dismantle an entire smuggling ring. They convince themselves that the rigid, archaic laws of the Lex Imperialis are insufficient for the immediate, dire reality of their situation. This is the critical, foundational crack in the psychic fortress. By embracing the philosophy that the ends justify the means, the host voluntarily dismantles their own moral absolute. In the physical universe, this is merely a pragmatic compromise. But in the hyper-reactive dimension of the warp, that compromise is a gaping, bleeding wound in the fabric of their soul. The psychological trap securely snaps shut the moment the host begins to actively conceal their newfound clarity from the surrounding structures of the Imperium. This concealment is rarely born of malicious intent to betray humanity. Rather, it stems from a tragic, blinding arrogance. The host convinces themselves that the Inquisition is simply too blind, too entrenched in archaic superstition to comprehend this vital, necessary truth they have discovered. They believe they are the sole enlightened intellect in a system of frightened animals. By severing their intellectual and emotional ties with the external world, they willingly step into an airtight psychological vacuum. They retreat entirely into their own localized echo chamber of warped logic, systematically removing any external friction that might challenge their descent. In this self-imposed isolation, the dark whisper fundamentally changes its acoustic nature. It ceases to be perceived as an external, alien influence. The entity seamlessly merges its frequency with the host's own internal monologue. The host no longer hears a demon offering a bargain. They hear their own inner voice, suddenly far more confident, far more ruthless, and entirely liberated from the burden of guilt. The horrific suggestions of the abyss are seamlessly translated into original, brilliant ideas conceived by the host's own genius. The parasite entirely bypasses the immune system because the host has been tricked into recognizing the parasite as a vital organ. This is the architecture of the perfect theological cage. The host actively constructs it, welds the iron bars, and locks the door entirely from the inside. They do this while genuinely, passionately believing they have just discovered the ultimate key to unlocking the universe. They view the surrounding galaxy with a mixture of pity and contempt, waiting for the day they can bestow their dark enlightenment upon the blind masses. They are entirely unaware that the profound, warm clarity they are experiencing is merely the digestive acid of a dark god slowly dissolving their consciousness. As the metaphysical tether to the warp completely solidifies, the first and most profound casualty within the host's mind is human empathy. The psychological shift is agonizingly slow but absolute. The host's perception of their fellow citizens fundamentally and violently degrades. They no longer look upon their starving, exhausted peers and see brothers in suffering, nor do they see fellow servants of the God Emperor. The sudden influx of warp-fueled arrogance elevates their consciousness to a perceived godhood. Looking down from this artificial peak, humanity is abruptly reclassified. The masses are no longer people. They are unawakened cattle. They are biological clay, utterly devoid of inherent value, waiting to be molded by the host's superior enlightened hands. The very people the host initially compromised their soul to protect are the first to be fed into the meat grinder of their new philosophy. This is not the chaotic, cartoonish malice of a fairy tale villain. It is the cold, terrifying rationalization of a mind that believes it has transcended standard mortal morality. A corrupted planetary governor does not order a mass execution because he revels in the sound of screaming. He orders it because the demographic data suggests that a 30% population reduction will optimize the atmospheric recyclers and create a perfect, mathematically sterile society. He is entirely convinced that the blood he is spilling is simply the necessary, unfortunate lubricant for a grander cosmic machinery that only he is intelligent enough to operate. This mathematical justification of horror is the hallmark of a soul that has passed the point of no return. The host becomes an immaculate engine of functional cruelty. The emotional weight of taking a human life, which once caused them profound psychological distress, is entirely amputated. They review casualty reports and atrocity statistics with the cold, detached boredom of an accountant balancing a ledger. The screams of the dying do not register as a tragedy. They register as a temporary, auditory nuisance. The host has successfully excised the fundamental core of their humanity, replacing it with a hollow, echoing chamber filled only with the deafening roar of their own colossal ego. Simultaneously, the central nervous system of the host begins to subtly, irreversibly rewrite its own biological architecture to safely accommodate the raw, radioactive influx of warp energy. This is where the physical corruption finally aligns with the psychological decay. The brain stops processing sensory data in the manner a healthy human should. The natural instinct of self-preservation, the biological terror of the unnatural, is violently inverted. The host walks through a corridor heavily irradiated by warp magic, and instead of feeling their skin blister and their stomach heave, they feel a profound, intoxicating warmth. The cosmic radiation feels like sunlight on a winter morning. Their biology is actively betraying them, adapting to thrive in an environment that is actively tearing reality apart. This inversion of perception is the ultimate victory of the ruinous powers. Where an ordinary, uncorrupted citizen would look upon a battlefield of mutating flesh and screaming demons and completely lose their sanity, the corrupted mind perceives a beautiful, complex symphony of biological liberation. They look at a monstrous, writhing horror of the warp and see absolute, divine perfection. The aesthetic of the grimdark universe is flipped. To the fallen, the sterile, ordered cathedrals of the Imperium are suffocating prisons, and the chaotic, blood-soaked slaughterhouses of the dark gods are pristine, welcoming sanctuaries. They are not merely accustomed to the horror, they are profoundly, aesthetically in love with it. This represents the final, irreversible threshold of spiritual and cognitive mutation. The individual's consciousness has not been erased, suppressed, or mind-controlled. That is the true terror of the fall. The host is fully awake, acutely aware of their actions, and operating with terrifying, deliberate efficiency. They do not fall kicking and screaming into the abyss, begging the Emperor for a salvation they know they do not deserve. They walk proudly, calmly, and with absolute conviction into the fire. They are absolutely certain that they are the only ones holding a torch in the dark, entirely blind to the fact that they are the ones burning. As the corruption deepens, the host enters the most intoxicating and dangerous phase of their descent, the illusion of absolute mastery. The entity dwelling within their mind does not immediately seize control of their motor functions or demand blood sacrifices. Instead, it operates like a flawless, infinitely powerful tool that perfectly yields to the host's desires. When the host requires unnatural charisma to sway a planetary council, the words flow like liquid gold. When they require the physical strength to crush a political rival, their muscles course with unholy, frictionless kinetic energy. The host genuinely believes they have successfully subjugated the raw power of the immaterium. They perceive themselves as a supreme occult architect, a visionary who has managed to leash a hurricane and use it to power their own personal ambitions. The fatal flaw in this grand delusion is a profound misunderstanding of the transaction's currency. The warp does not grant power, it loans it, and the collateral is the structural integrity of the human soul. Every single time the host consciously taps into this dark reservoir, every time they cast a minor hex, manipulate a mind, or even simply rely on their newfound preternatural intuition, they are not siphoning from a battery. They are allowing a highly corrosive acid to flow through the delicate plumbing of their own psyche. The dark power performs the requested task flawlessly, but as it recedes, it intentionally hollows out a microscopic fragment of the host's original identity, leaving behind a perfectly shaped cavity that only the dark god can fill. The exact moment the trap irreversibly springs usually occurs during a climax of manufactured crisis. The host finds themselves facing an insurmountable obstacle, a loyalist siege, an inquisitorial audit, or a lethal assassination attempt. In a fraction of a second, they realize their mortal capabilities are entirely insufficient to survive. They do not hesitate. They reach deeper into the abyss than ever before, demanding a miracle of catastrophic proportions. They reach into the dark to grab a weapon, entirely unaware that the weapon is reaching back. In that singular, terrifying microsecond, the dynamic of power permanently, violently inverts. The host does not pull the power up into the physical world. The abyss simply grabs their soul and pulls it down. This is the quiet, unspectacular death of human hesitation. Before this exact moment, there was always a phantom pain in the host's mind, a microscopic, lingering microsecond of doubt, born from decades of imperial indoctrination. There was always a quiet voice whispering that they were walking too close to the edge, But as the dark power floods their system, completing the circuit, that voice is abruptly, violently assassinated. The hesitation vanishes entirely. Action and dark intent become perfectly, seamlessly unified. The host executes the atrocity, the mass sacrifice, the betrayal of their closest allies, with the terrifying, frictionless efficiency of a machine executing a flawless line of code. They feel no regret, no fear, and no doubt. They feel only the cold, absolute perfection of purpose. Simultaneously, the physical environment immediately surrounding the host begins to softly weep in response to their severed state. The host has become a walking, breathing tear in the fabric of reality. The laws of physics in their immediate vicinity begin to quietly rot. Shadows cast by lumen globes detach and pool in the wrong directions. The ambient temperature plummets, freezing the condensation on the bulkheads, yet the air smells overpoweringly of ozone, burnt copper, and sweet, decaying meat. Animals in the lower decks violently claw their own eyes out, rather than look in the host's direction. The physical universe instinctively recognizes what the host's blinded ego cannot. They are no longer a citizen of real space. They are an invasive, toxic spore. Yet standing at the summit of their perceived triumph, surrounded by the bleeding corpses of their enemies and the warped geometry of their new reality, the delusion of the host reaches its absolute zenith. They look at their trembling, blood-soaked hands and see the indisputable proof of their own godhood. They believe they have successfully conquered the galaxy, outsmarted the Inquisition, and broken the chains of the Emperor. But in the swirling, chaotic depths of the Imperium, the dark gods look at those exact same hands and see nothing but perfectly calibrated, flawlessly attached puppet strings. To comprehend the true horror of the fall, one must observe the metaphysical severing from a cosmic perspective. When a human soul is finally, completely compromised, it does not trigger a loud alarm across the galaxy. It is a quiet, tragic consumption. Within the roaring, turbulent ocean of the Imperium, the soul of the host originally shone as a tiny, dim spark of order, a microscopic pixel of the Emperor's light. The exact moment of the fall is the moment that spark is permanently extinguished, instantly replaced by a miniature localized black hole. It is a total spiritual inversion. The host ceases to be an independent organism capable of generating its own emotional light. They become an infinite localized gravity well, designed exclusively to drag everything around them down into the dark. The biological and psychological override is now absolute. The soul is no longer an independent variable capable of free will or genuine evolution. It is violently rewritten to become a biological extension of their patron god's core philosophy. If claimed by Khorne, the host's complex strategic mind is lobotomized, replaced by an agonizing, unquenchable thirst for kinetic violence. If claimed by Nurgle, their human fear of death is overwritten by a sickening, euphoric desire to cultivate terminal disease. They no longer possess personal ambitions. Their grand original designs, the desire to protect, to improve, to seek justice, are completely eradicated, replaced by a terrifyingly simple, singular directive dictated by an entity that views them merely as a disposable syringe. The erasure of the host's past is executed with brutal, agonizing precision. The memories of their previous life are not deleted. They are intentionally, maliciously distorted. The host remembers the faces of their family, the loyalty of their comrades, and the oaths they swore to the Golden Throne. But they view these memories through a lens of absolute, visceral disgust. They look back at their uncorrupted self and see a weak, pathetic, brainwashed animal. The love they once felt is violently transmuted into profound contempt. This is the ultimate defense mechanism of the parasite. It ensures that the host will never, under any circumstances, desire to return to the light, because the light now physically nauseates them. The most terrifying aspect of this final stage is its absolute, unbreakable irreversibility. If a squad of inquisitorial stormtroopers were to somehow capture the host and drag them into the radius of a psychic blank, a pariah whose mere presence completely severs connection to the warp, the host would not suddenly wake up and thank them for the rescue. The dark power would indeed be severed, but the underlying human architecture has been so heavily, structurally modified by the warp that it can no longer support its own weight. Stripped of the chaotic energy holding their shattered psyche together, the host does not revert to humanity. They simply collapse into a screaming, violently seizing vegetative husk. They cannot be saved. They can only be mercifully destroyed. To an uncorrupted observer, a former comrade or an investigating inquisitor, the physical encounter with the fully fallen host is an experience steeped in the deepest, most agonizing, uncanny valley. The entity standing before them looks exactly like their lost friend. It wears their stolen uniform, it speaks with their exact vocal cadence, and it possesses all of their intimate memories. But the micro-expressions are entirely wrong. The breathing pattern is too rhythmic, too calculated, and the eyes are utterly, terrifyingly dead. The observer realizes with soul-crushing certainty that they are not speaking to a traitor. They are speaking to an unfathomably ancient, predatory intelligence that is simply wearing their friend's skin as a tailored biological suit. The exact moment is complete. The transition from a struggling, suffering human being into a perfectly functioning biological terminal for a dark god is finalized. The tragedy of the sovereign myth is fulfilled in the most horrific manner possible. The host successfully rebelled against the suffocating, brutal oppression of the Imperium. They broke their chains. They defied the Emperor, and they achieved what they genuinely believed to be absolute, uncontested freedom. Only in the very end, as their consciousness slowly dissolves entirely into the laughing abyss, do they realize the terminal punchline of the cosmos. They merely traded a cruel, indifferent master for one that will spend the rest of eternity enthusiastically digesting their soul. The completion of the fall does not register on Imperial Auspex scanners. There is no seismic shockwave, no sudden eclipse of the sun, and no grand cosmic alarm when a soul is finally permanently extinguished. The host simply stands amidst the ruin of their former life, their breathing steady, their pulse remarkably calm. The frantic, agonizing internal civil war that raged within their psyche for months, or perhaps years, has finally ceased. The deafening silence that replaces it is not the peace of resolution. It is the sterile, absolute quiet of a freshly dug grave. The warp entity has finished rearranging the architecture of the host's mind, and now it comfortably sits upon the throne of their consciousness. The physical vessel, the flesh, the bone, the intricate nervous system, is now entirely subjugated, functioning merely as a biological spacesuit for a creature of the immaterium. The host's original biological imperatives are rewritten in real time. They do not require sleep, for the warp entity does not tire. They do not require conventional sustenance, for their cells are now fueled by the raw, ambient suffering of the physical world. If you were to open their veins, you would not find the rich, oxygenated blood of a human being. You would find a thick, necrotic sludge that smells of ozone and ancient copper. The host has become a walking, breathing metaphysical contagion, engineered exclusively to spread the rot of their patron god. The most profound tragedy of this transformation is its absolute insignificance on the macroscopic scale. The Imperium of Man spans 1,000,000 worlds, and the exact moment this host falls, 1,000 more are simultaneously breaking under the same crushing pressure. The administratum does not record the death of their soul. A clerk in a lightless spire merely notes a statistical deviation in the sector's tithe output, or flags the host's regiment for inquisitorial review. The monumental cosmic horror of a human being, consumed from the inside out, is reduced to a microscopic rounding error in the grand ledger of a dying empire. The universe does not weep for them. It simply recalibrates the mathematics of its own decay. The true terror of their new existence lies in the total annihilation of the Emperor's mercy. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the ultimate comfort for the dying loyalist is the belief that their soul will return to the Golden Throne, finding rest in the light of the Master of Mankind. But for the fallen, that bridge has been violently, permanently burned. When this biological vessel is finally destroyed, whether by the righteous bolter of a space marine or the eventual inevitable betrayal of their own chaotic allies, their soul will not dissipate into the void. It will be violently yanked directly into the deepest, most agonizing depths of the warp, instantly claimed by the predator they mistakenly believed they had tamed. This is the terminal, inescapable paradox of the chaotic rebellion. The host initiated this descent because they could no longer tolerate the suffocating, brutal slavery of the Imperium. They reached into the dark because they desperately wanted to be the master of their own destiny, to rewrite the unfair laws of a cruel galaxy. But in their desperate pursuit of absolute freedom, they unknowingly volunteered for an eternity of absolute subjugation. They traded a cold, distant emperor who demanded their labor for an intimately present, malevolent god who demands their total, agonizing unmaking. They did not break the wheel of suffering, they simply strapped themselves directly to its burning axle. And deep down, locked away in the most inaccessible, microscopic corner of their own rewritten mind, a tiny fragment of the original host remains. It is not enough to control a single muscle, nor is it enough to vocalize a single scream. It is merely enough to act as a helpless, fully conscious spectator. This tiny original spark is forced to watch through its own eyes as its hands slaughter its friends, burn its cities, and tear down everything it once loved. The entity allows this fragment to survive for one specific cruel reason, because a tragedy is not truly complete unless the victim is awake to witness the absolute, irreversible ruin of their own soul. The galaxy is not a stage for heroes. It is an ocean of absolute crushing pressure, and the human mind is merely a fragile glass vessel dropped far too deep. When the hull finally cracks, it does not matter how pure your intentions were. The water rushing in does not care about your justifications. It only cares about filling the empty space. Archive this truth. The line between a loyal saint and a monstrous heretic is not a wall of iron. It is a single, exhausted sigh in the dark. It is the exact moment you stop fighting the pressure and decide to let the water in.